Hello everyone, and thank you for joining this month's Spotlight Talk focused on Wharton Esherick's blanket chest. My name is Ethan Snyder, and I'm the Manager of Collections and Public Programs at the Wharton Esherick Museum. So if you've been on site recently, you might have had a chance to see this gorgeous chest in person. If you've stopped by the museum's visitor center to see our current exhibition, Movement is Life. If you haven't had a chance to see this blanket chest yet, I highly encourage you to stop by our visitor center before the exhibition closes on June 2nd. And unlike getting a tour of the museum, no advanced reservation is required to see the show in RBC. The exhibition explores modern dance as a catalyst for Esherick's creative transformation from an underappreciated painter to an experimental artist in wood. You'll have a chance to see some of Esherick's earliest work in wood, done between the years 1919 and 1924, and the exhibition brings together a number of Wharton's early woodblock prints, a beautiful Impressionist painting that he did in Fairhope, Alabama, this fantastic carved chest, some ephemera from the dance camp in the Adirondacks, as well as a slideshow of really gorgeous family photographs that we scanned from an album. So today's talk is going to focus and explore this antique chest that Esherick carved in 1922. And as we explore this really early carving project, we're going to be touching on the story of how Esherick acquired the object, the imagery he carved into its surface, some preparatory drawings done for another carved piece of furniture, as well as some of the modifications that Esherick possibly made to this chest that could be some of his earliest joinery work ever. Plus, we'll briefly explore some similar blanket chests to better understand the object's history and what's found inside. What we know about the chest primarily comes from an interview transcript with Wharton Esherick that some of his family members did with him, as well as some of the documentation we have surrounding his other carved pieces, and of course, a really good dose of close looking. So the current Movement is Life exhibition, I think, is a really great way to help us contextualize this carved chest. So the exhibition places the chest within Esherick's earliest years in wood in the first half of the 1920s. And as is really well storied at the museum, Wharton Esherick's work in wood began with him carving frames for his paintings. And with one of his first ever commissions, the book Rhymes of Early Jungle Folk, Esherick began to explore printmaking and woodblock carving in the earliest years of that decade. The carved antique chest comes from this very early period where Esherick was very first beginning to work with wood, primarily through carving those frames and those woodblocks. So in just 3 years between his earliest carved frames, and one of them we can see here, some of his early woodblock prints, one of which we can see here along with the original woodblock, Esherick was able to fully execute like very expressive pictorial carvings. And to quote my brilliant colleague Holly Gore, who's in the room now, from her recent exhibition talk, quote, "In Esherick's early wood carving practice, the line between furniture making and printmaking was fluid," end quote. The way Esherick expresses line, energy, and patterns between his carved furniture, his woodblocks, and his frames is really indistinguishable. So what we see when we get up close and personal with Esherick's carved chest is really nothing short of an autobiography of the Esherick family's home life. And here we can see the signature he inscribed into the lip of the chest. And already in 1922, Esherick as an artist was signing his work in wood. So carved into 3 of its surfaces are depictions of the family farmhouse and their property, which is just a short walk down the hillside from Esherick's 1926 studio. Here we can see the farmhouse that they named Sunekrest, with the rising sun detail that Esherick carved into the home's chimney and into their windows as well. The building that's depicted next to Sunekrest here is the barn that's adjacent to their farmhouse that Esherick used as an early painting studio. And then on this third side of the chest, we see Sunekrest from another vantage point, and next to it is that very well storied old growth cherry tree that once adorned the yard, alongside the kind of fields of vegetation that the family was surrounded by. So this really, in a lot of ways, is an autobiography of the Esherick family life in the early 20s. So luckily, the story of how Wharton acquired this chest is pretty well documented in an oral history that the museum founders, Ruth Esherick, which is Wharton's daughter, and her husband Bob conducted with Wharton late in his life. Esherick recalls that he bought the chest from an antique dealer out in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, named Mrs. Kookaroo. One day, Esherick was walking through her antique shop and decided to go into a barn or shed-like structure that was outside. And once he was inside that barn, he craned his neck to look up at what was on the shelves. And way up on the third shelf, barely visible from where Esherick stood, he saw this chest that he would later carve. And as Esherick and Mrs. Cuckaroo looked up at the chest together with their necks craned, Mrs. Cuckaroo offered Esherick the chest for $50. He purchased the chest at this price, later saying that, quote, he bought it blind, but that it was a good chest nonetheless. So I guess the question now is, what was it that Esherick purchased for $50 way back in the early 20s or even a little earlier than that? Today, of course, we know and refer to it as Esherick's carved chest. However, before Wharton acquired it and modified it, it was something fundamentally different. So when we're looking for comparable blanket chests, we can focus on a few things such as the hardware, the drawer style, and the wood used. The chest that Esherick purchased is likely of Pennsylvania German origin, and the wood that is used primarily is walnut. Poplar and pine were also used, but in areas that wouldn't be publicly seen, such as the inside of the chest at the bottom of the main compartment, as well as the drawer sides, the drawer bottoms, and the drawer backs that you're just not going to see when the piece is closed. For German and Dutch immigrants in 18th century Pennsylvania, this type of chest was known as a dower chest. It was commonly used by young unmarried women to store and collect clothing and linens in anticipation of married life. So, for example, sewing was an extremely important household task in the 18th century, and girls would learn to sew from a young age, and the blanket chest would likely house her finished projects. These chests could have been made by their father or brother, and usually measured about 4 feet in length with a hinged lid and painted with traditional Pennsylvania German motifs, such as we see on this chest here at the Winterthur Museum in Delaware. And while this example here is painted, it's not made of walnut, but rather of pine. And the construction is very similar, where we see dovetails joining the edges or corners of the piece. And other similarities is that they both have wrought iron hinges, a till with an adjoining secret compartment that we will look at later in Esherick's piece. And while not all chests do survive with the paint intact, there does really not seem to be any evidence that Wharton's chest was ever painted. There are maybe 2 small flecks of paint on the top of the piece, but they don't show up anywhere else. So it's unlikely that Esherick would have stripped the paint off of something like this and it would have just come bare. And because it's made of walnut, that's another reason why it probably wasn't painted. Walnut is a wood that tends to look a lot like mahogany, so it's valued for its aesthetic qualities. So this chest that we see here on the bottom is also from the Winterthur Museum. This one actually just out of Chester County, like Esherick's was, or likely was. And you can see that this is an unpainted walnut because it was valued for those aesthetic qualities. Both of these chests come from about the 1780s, although the chest at the top has a range extended into the early 19th century. But when we're trying to narrow down dates for a chest like Wharton's for figuring out when it was originally made, we can actually look at the hardware. So as I just said, we can't be exactly certain the year that Esherick's chest dates to. However, it is likely somewhere, I would argue, in the mid-18th century. Along with the related chests, we can use the hardware to roughly help us determine the years or period that it was made. So for example, on the side of the screen here, we're looking at 2 trade catalogs from the 1780s for furniture hardware, including escutcheons, hinges, and drawer pulls. Both of these are out of Birmingham, England, which was a hub for brass manufacturing, and they show very, very similar Queen Anne hardware that we see on Esherick's chest. So the legs are not any help in determining what year Esherick made this chest, or what year the chest was originally made, and that's because Esherick likely modified them himself after purchasing it. The original legs that Wharton would have probably seen when the piece was pulled down from the top shelf in the antique shop were likely a little taller than the present ones, and they would have not extended as far along the base and would have been much narrower. So if we turn back to this slide quickly, we can see that the legs extend pretty far down the base, whereas these terminate much closer to the corner. So this brings us now to how Esherick modified the chest beyond the intricate scenery that he carved into its surfaces. We're led to believe here at the museum that the feet to this chest are not original and that they are probably, likely, however you want to put it, some of the earliest examples of Esherick's joinery work. We can't be certain that Esherick replaced the feet completely, and that there is a small possibility that he could have purchased it without legs altogether. But nonetheless, there are a number of signs that suggest to us that the chest's current feet are attributable to Wharton. So for one, when we look at the feet under raking light, we can see that there's some subtle texture that's highlighted on the wood surface left by a chisel. Wharton, we know, worked with chisels a lot as he was carving things, and so why not carve new feet onto this chest? But in addition, we can also see that the dovetails on the feet here are remarkably larger than the dovetails on the original part of the chest. So if you look at the end of the tails on the body, you'll notice how fine they are and they almost come to a point, whereas the ones that Esherick might have added don't come to that fine point like the ones on the original part of the chest do. Now, 1922 would have been a considerably early time for Esherick's joinery work. However, it's not out of the realm of possibilities that he worked on these himself rather than with the help of his cabinet-making collaborator, John Schmidt. So we know that John Schmidt first started to work with Wharton in 1924 when the two of them collaborated on a trestle table for the Hedgerow Theater that was utilizing an old piano top. However, there was a job with John Schmidt that predates this 1924 project, but Wharton doesn't specify what date it took place. This first project, though, was John Schmidt being hired to outfit a Ford chassis that Wharton had acquired with walnut and hickory paneling. So this chest was done 2 years before the first documented project that we have between the two of them, but it's possible that this could have been done around the same time that they started working on Wharton's car. But in any case, there are a few peculiarities about the base that Esherick added that make me think that he did not have any help from a German-trained cabinet maker. So for one, there aren't any back legs on this blanket chest. Rather, we have one single continuous board that runs the full width of the chest and that touches all the way down to the floor. So it's not really a foot at all. It's just one panel at the bottom, at the back of the chest. And what I think is more interesting than that is this idiosyncrasy on this carved chest that our conservator, Mark Anderson, calls a classic beginner's mistake when one is first experimenting with dovetails. And I see Larissa laughing here. So looking at the dovetails that join the back board to the side legs, we can see that Esherick started a dovetail that was inverted here that I've circled in each piece. We can see that this other dovetail is done correctly where these pieces fan out. However, he just does this backwards and inverts it. So essentially, both I think the tail and the pin are tapering the wrong way. So it's not really holding anything in place. Fortunately, though, these mistakes wouldn't have been seen because they appear on the bottom of the chest way towards the back, which could have meant that Esherick didn't really feel the need to correct his mistakes. But I'm left wondering, could these dovetails, have been early mistakes by someone known as the Dean of the American Craftsmen? And if Esherick attempted these dovetails before meeting a skilled craftsperson like John Schmidt, would he have used a book to guide him, or would he have mimicked the extant dovetails on the chest or another piece of furniture that he had hanging around the family farmhouse? So before we take a look inside the blanket chest, I do want to highlight a part of Esherick's work process that helped him prepare to design and make carvings like the ones that adorn the blanket chest. So unfortunately, we don't have existing preparatory drawings for the blanket chest itself, but we do have preparatory drawings for a carved bench that Esherick did the same year in 1922. You might be familiar with this chest because it lived in our visitor center for a number of years before being shipped off to our offsite storage location. Um, the sketch itself, unfortunately, is infected with mold and has been isolated from the rest of the collection, but we're still able to access it for documentation purposes. So here we see this pencil sketch that Esherick did on linen paper that by now is quite frail. But we can see how this preparatory sketch translates into this finished wooden carving with the similar organic shapes and lines running through, which we also see adorning Esherick's blanket chest as well. So now let's turn to what's inside the chest. And I think that this stuff is super neat. So we're going to start with the oldest aspects of the chest first, and then we'll move forward chronologically in time. So one thing that is really exemplary about this chest as a piece of 18th century furniture is that it has this component called the till that we see here, and that the till on Esherick's blanket chest is actually still intact. A lot of Pennsylvania German blanket chests don't have their tills intact, so it is really nice that Esherick preserved this piece and that it's still on today. So a till is a compartment that often appears on the inside of the chest towards the right-hand side of the interior, as we see here. It has a lid, and it kind of looks like a pencil case. And it's really due to their delicacy and the fact that they hold up the lid to the blanket chest that they don't often survive. But whether or not a till does survive into the present day, they do leave behind what we call witness marks that tell us that they were once there. And this is that witness mark that we see. And they're created by opening and closing the till over a number of years, and it just scratches into the surface of the wood, and it leaves that evidence that something was there interacting with this. But it's always also worth looking under the till of a blanket chest because sometimes there's a surprise if you're willing to look a little further. So you can see here that the side of the till happens to actually be set into a groove, which means that you can lift it out of place if you're willing to be a little brave. And lifting the side of the till reveals a secret drawer compartment that we can see here that's actually hidden underneath. And this would have probably been used to stash away money, or if it was available to the original owner, silver or gold, things that could have been used as currency, valuable for trading, or something that was inherited and wanted to be passed down. So I think that it's super cool that this still survives on Esherick's blanket chest as well. And it has a really small iron drawer pull to it. And you can tell because it would never be seen except for by the person who is using it, that there really isn't any decoration that was needed to add to that. So another interesting find when we open up the blanket chest is that there are two cubbies that are made of pine ply that slide along runners that are set into the front and back of the interior that we can see the back of here. And it's difficult to determine exactly who added these to the chest. However, I'm led to believe that it might have been Esherick's son-in-law, Bob Bascom. After founding the Wharton Esherick Museum and moving into Wharton's 1956 workshop with Ruth Esherick, the two of them lived with and used this blanket chest for a number of decades. The square cubbies are joined together with rabbets at the corners, and they're not held in place with traditional dovetails, but rather with this thing that we call a pin and cove joint that came into fashion in the late 19th century as technology and machinery were advancing to help mass produce furniture. And as far as I've ever seen, Wharton Esherick never really utilized coven pin joinery as a construction for himself, nor have I ever seen that in a piece of John Schmidt's work either. Um, and additionally, the relative cleanliness and condition of these cubbies do seem to suggest that they would be much newer than Esherick's 1922 additions to the chest. So I think a nice way to conclude this talk is merely to draw our attention to the long and powerful history of this single object that affected many people and that was also affected by many people. It dates all the way back to the 18th century and hence is close to over 250 years old and has been continually reimagined over its long life. Like many objects that pass between hands and generations, this chest meant many different things to each person who encountered it and made use of it. Its original owner, or to its original owner, it may have marked a young woman's coming of marriageable age and her education in matters of the domestic sphere. Once it was in the possession of Mrs. Kookaroo 100 years later and up on that high shelf in her barn, it marked a way for an early 20th century woman to make an independent living. Once Esherick reimagines this chest with his carving tools, it becomes something a little more. The chest now meant that Esherick could continue to experiment with new ways of personal expression in wood. And as it sat in their home down the hill, it was not only an object that adorned their domestic life, but an object that was also adorned by their domestic life through the scenes that Esherick carved into its surface. And if our conjecture about Bob Bascom's work on this chest is correct, it was transformed again in the later half of the 20th century to meet new needs with the addition of the cubbies and the drawer runners, before finally becoming what we would consider today as a museum object, where we seek to preserve all the changes that it's undergone over its long and storied life. So before we wrap up and open everything up to questions, I want to highlight some events that are really exciting that are taking place in the coming months. So on June 9th, we have a really exciting performance in the workshop by three incredibly talented professors at Ursinus College. On June 12th, we are going to be discussing the recent biography of Louis Kahn by Wendy Lesser on Wednesday, June 12th in a Louis Kahn building. So I highly recommend that if you are into Louis Kahn, you want to get into the workshop, check out this book, come join us for our conversation about it. And then finally, on June 21st, we are having our second iteration of a solstice evening. This time it's going to be a conversation with Dr. Tom Geiler from the Oneida Community Mansion House, who's going to be chatting with us about ways of intentional living. So that is about it for the slide deck. So I'll stop sharing. And I think beyond that, that's all we got for today.